with some things about how his epistemology carries over in application to matters of religion, to ethics, and his writings on politics. Perhaps the crucial point of connection between his epistemology and these other areas of thought is the evidentialism which we highlighted last time. That is to say, his insistence that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. That we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. Now, that has a very evident kind of effect when it comes to his discussion about revelation and reason, faith and reason, which he gets into actually in Book 4 of his essay concerning human understanding, in chapters 18 and 19. I mention that so that you can look them up since they're not in our anthology. And both of those chapters work on the assumption that revelation may be regarded as the addition of further propositions to those which we know by reason alone. Now, reflect on that for a moment. The first reaction you might have is, yes, knowledge, as he talks about it, consists of propositions. Propositions that embody judgments, with subject and predicate. After all, knowledge derives from ideas where you predicate something of a subject. So we've been talking about knowledge in that sense. Revelation adds to that knowledge additional propositions that are not known by reason alone. So revelation then is propositional revelation. And the orthodoxy in you may feel like applauding John Locke, but it should be noted that he tends to confine his thinking about divine revelation to simply added propositions. That is to say, the interpersonal immediacy of religious experience is not something which he includes within that definition of revelation. And we'll be commenting on this a little bit more later on. He seems to be quite adverse to what he thinks of as any continuing revelation of a private sort, such as in some of the pietist traditions, holiness traditions of that day, were becoming evident, even in Wesley. That was known as enthusiasm. And he has a whole chapter in which he opposes religious enthusiasm in that sense. Now, the underlying reason for this, as I say, is in his view that all knowledge is propositional, consisting of propositions. So that revelation consists of propositions. Some revealed propositions may be known also by reason, but obviously if they're known by revelation as well, they're not known by reason alone. His point is that propositions that are in accordance with reason may well be acceptable as revelation. propositions that go beyond reason, but are not contradicting reason, would likewise be acceptable candidates as revelation. But anything which goes contrary to reason, contradicts reason, could not be revelation. His point being simply that what we know of what God has made by natural reason cannot be contradicted by what God has said by special revelation. God does not contradict himself. But woven through that is sort of a rational criterion. Let reason be your guide. A rational criterion for the evaluation of purported revelation. Now, granted that there is indeed divine revelation of this sort, revealed propositions have the highest degree of certainty of all propositions, because they come to us from God with his certification, as it were. The question is, how do we know what is revealed? And that is what has to be adjudged by reason. So revelation, then, consisting of propositions. Now, faith, therefore, is defined in that regard. Faith is assent to propositions on the credit or testimony of the proposer. It is assent to propositions on the testimony of the proposer. And let me read a couple of short paragraphs here about what he has to say about reason in relationship to faith. Reason, as distinguished from faith, I take to be the discovery of the certainty or probability of propositions or truths which the mind arrives at by deduction from ideas which it has by means of natural faculties. That is to say, ideas known by sensation or reflection. So reason, then, is the discovery of the certainty or probability of propositions deduced from ideas acquired by natural means. Faith, on the other hand, is assent to any proposition that is not made out by reason, but upon the credit of the proposer as coming from God in some extraordinary way of communication. This way of discovering truths to men we call revelation. So faith is assent to proposition. And again, you might well ask yourself, is that the totality of his conception of faith? Seems to be a purely cognitive kind of act. Well, it's in the light of that what he calls enthusiasm, private revelation, inner light kind of revelation, as in the Quaker tradition, those kinds of things are by him discarded. Revelation without reason cannot be assented to. So revelation and reason. Now, Locke seems to be fairly guarded in what he says. There's more problem, I think, in what he doesn't say than in what he does say. But what he does say, taken by itself, seemed to open the door for a kind of approach to religion independently of revelation. And so the development of deism in the 18th century is often ascribed to Locke's unwitting influence. That is to say, one can know a great deal by reason alone, and deism is an attempt to develop a religious view by means of reason alone, independently of revelation. So deism then traces something of its beginnings to Locke. You have to say, though, that even before Locke, there was quite actively developing in Britain what was known as natural religion, sometimes in a Platonic context, but ever since the Renaissance it had been developing. That is to say, religion on the basis of natural knowledge alone, independently of revelation. So deism was on one hand a further development of that, and on the other hand it was a development that seems to have been spurred by Lockean epistemology. Okay, any question, comment there? Yeah.
So Locke has say Christ and miracles.
Yes.
Were they outside of reason, therefore they could not be?
No, he himself, you see, accepts not only the possibility of revelation, but accepts the Christian revelation, accepts the Scripture. In his book, The Reasonableness of Christianity, you might want to take a look at that. What he does is to look at Christianity using the kind of rational criterion that we've mentioned. And depending on whose interpretation of what he's saying you follow, he can be taken as a thoroughly orthodox Christian. His emphasis in talking of Christ is much more on Christ as the Messiah than it is on Christ, the incarnate second person of the Trinity. But just a quick scanning of that book makes it obvious that it's his attempt to pull together biblical propositions into some sort of coherent teaching. That's his work, The Reasonableness of Christianity. He has another work on religion called Letter on Toleration, a letter on toleration, which perhaps is helpful in putting the context there. This is at the end of the 17th century, when England had gone through its civil war, which was a mixture of religious and political conflict. The Catholic-Protestant conflict in England continued way on through the 17th century with James II, who was finally ousted from the throne, you remember, in a bloodless revolution in 1688. And the Protestants, William and Mary, came over from Holland to take over the throne. So there was that tension all the time. There wasn't much tolerance. In fact, it was in that period that a 5-mile